Yes, we are online.
Thank you, Sema. Thanks for inviting me in this wonderful, really wonderful international symposium on economic thought, and welcome to everybody, to all those who are here connected. It's an honor for me to chair this section. Therefore, thanks again to RePEcT, the main organizer of this international symposium. And today, in this special session, we are going to have Professor Craig Smith. He's Adam Smith Senior Lecturer in the Scottish Enlightenment, and he's going to deliver a speech on the moral and political thought of the Scottish Enlightenment. Therefore, thanks, Professor Craig Smith. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What I want to do today is to talk about the relationship between what we regard nowadays as two separate subjects, moral philosophy and political economy or economics. And I want to do that by looking at how the Scottish Enlightenment regarded the relationship between what they saw as part of the same intellectual project. So what I want to do here is examine the tight connection between moral philosophy and political economy in two passages by two of the leading moral philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment. Adam Smith, of course, famous today to us as the founding father of economics, and Adam Ferguson, his counterpart at the University of Edinburgh during the high period of the Scottish Enlightenment. In the literature on the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith is often held up as an enthusiast about commercial society, and Adam Ferguson as a more sceptical critic of commercial society. This, I want to argue today, is a mistake. Both are more nuanced thinkers, and we can begin to understand how they are more nuanced thinkers by looking at the connections they make between the subject of ethics or moral philosophy and this newer discipline of political economy. Underlying this will be a comparison of their analysis of the desire to better one's own condition, which Smith sees as a central motivating feature of human beings, a view that Ferguson shares with them. But it's a central motivating feature of human beings which has both positive, in the sense of generating wealth and development, but also negative in the danger of moral corruption consequences. So just to lay the broad scene out before we move into the specifics. The Scottish Enlightenment is widely recognised as a key stage in the development of the modern discipline of economics. The Scottish Enlightenment predates an academic division of labour, which separates out the disciplines of economics, political science, and philosophy. What that means is that the thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment understood political economy as part of moral philosophy. So what I want to do as we go through the talk today is look at where political economy appears in the moral philosophy lectures of the Scottish Enlightenment and where political economy appears in the moral philosophy books of the Scottish Enlightenment. Both of these serve to illustrate how political economy is encased in a system of moral philosophy for both Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson. And that will help us to understand some of the problems that I'm going to raise later on about their discussion of the desire to improve one's situation. So first of all, Scottish moral philosophy in the 18th century was a very distinctive discipline. It was a broad-based and educationally focused system of practical ethics, which was intended to inculcate, to generate virtue in the students. The studies that a lot of academics and historians have done on the period has described the professors of moral philosophy in the 18th century Scottish universities as professors of virtue. Their job was not simply to describe arguments outlined by previous philosophers, their job was to make their students better people. In this paper, I'll focus on the two dominant figures of the high period of the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith, who was Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Glasgow, and Adam Ferguson, who was his equivalent at the University of Edinburgh. So where does political economy appear in the moral philosophy lectures of the likes of Smith and Ferguson in the 18th century Scottish context? Both Ferguson and Smith modelled their moral philosophy curriculum on that of Francis Hutcheson, Smith's teacher at the University of Glasgow, and an innovator in updating and modernising the teaching of moral philosophy in the Scottish universities. Hutcheson provided a historicised account of the development of human social institutions that drew heavily on the natural law tradition as typified by Pufendorf and on the moral philosophy of the Earl of Shaftesbury. Hutcheson, remember, would have been committed to this idea that his job was not simply to teach people arid or dry arguments about moral philosophy, it was instead to create well-rounded individuals of character who would be able to do the right thing when they went out into the world after studying in his classroom. So if we look at Hutcheson, we see a very clear order of delivery in the moral philosophy lectures, which explains to us the place that political economy has within the system as a whole. There's a broad division into 4 areas of study: natural theology, that is philosophical arguments for the existence of God; ethics, jurisprudence, and police. Hutcheson covered political economy under the heading of contract and discussed its prices, money, and interest. Political economy then fits into the discussion of police, that is, matters of everyday expediency or organisation for the community. But again, it's important to note that that was part of this wider structure, which included natural theology, ethics, and jurisprudence. We have the evidence of Smith's student, John Miller, that this was the scheme of Smith's lectures when he took over from Hutcheson at the University of Glasgow. And Miller tells us that the ethics section of Smith's lectures to his students broadly covered the content that became the theory of moral sentiments in 1759, and the jurisprudence and the police sections in the lectures partly mapped on to what became the Wealth of Nations in 1776. According to Miller, Smith moved through matters of principle, matters of law and justice, to questions of expediency, and political economy fell into this section of police or expediency within the wider ethical and philosophical framework that had been outlined by them. Adam Ferguson published various versions of his notes for students, and we can see from the analysis of moral philosophy and the institutes of moral philosophy that he followed the same scheme as Hutcheson of natural theology, ethics, jurisprudence, and police. By the time it comes to his final statement of his lecture material in the Principles of Moral and Political Science in 1792, the schema, the broad outline, is still the same as Hutcheson's, but there's significant revision to the political economy section, which now draws heavily on Smith's Wealth of Nations, as we might have expected, it having been published in 1776. For both Smith and Ferguson, then, political economy existed within a framework of practical ethics that was outlined by their moral philosophy. And this is important because I think it helps us to answer a puzzle or a question that might arise in their discussion of how economics impacts on certain moral philosophical arguments. So let's move on to this second issue. What is the place of political economy in the moral philosophy books of the Scottish Enlightenment? Now, just recall here that in the literature, it's often the case that Ferguson is seen as the skeptic about commercial society, and Smith is seen as the advocate of commercial society. What I want to do here is to pursue a shared concern in both Smith and Ferguson, where political economy appears in their consideration of moral philosophical questions. The background is their understanding of wealth and what motivates human beings to improve their situation. What Smith calls, in the theory of moral sentiments, that great purpose of human life, which we call bettering our condition. So what are the moral implications of bettering our condition? What do people understand bettering their condition to be? One way we can understand this is by looking at Adam Smith's definition of wealth. Every man is rich or poor according to the degree in which he can afford and enjoy the necessaries, conveniences, and amusements of human life. A society where there is order and good government will allow people to pursue the necessaries, the conveniences, and the elegances of life through economic development. If we turn to Adam Ferguson in his institutes, we find a very similar definition. Riches consist in the abundance of things that conduce to safety, subsistence, accommodation, and ornament. So there's a connection then between order and good government, the provision of subsistence, the provision of conveniences or accommodation, and the pursuit of ornament or the elegancies of life. And that's how we're to understand the field upon which political economy is played. And what I want to focus on now is a potential difficulty that both Smith and Ferguson identify with this. And we can find our way into this difficulty by thinking about this passage from the Theory of Moral Sentiments from Part 1, Chapter 3. And what we find if we look at this passage, particularly the area in bold, is that for Smith, much of what drives economic activity, much of what the subject matter of political economy is, has little to do with the necessities of life, the necessaries of nature. As he puts it, is it to supply the necessities of nature? The meanest labourer can supply them. We see that he can afford food, clothing, the comfort of a house and a family. The question that Smith wants to pursue is, well, what is it then if it's not the necessaries that drive most of our economic activity? And the answer, he believes, is that these superfluities, these conveniences, are things that we pursue for reasons that are socially generated. And they largely have to do with us comparing our current situation to the situations of those elsewhere in society, seeing the advantages that we perceive other people to have and wanting those advantages. That has nothing to do with the necessaries of life. It is pursuing the conveniences and what Ferguson would call ornaments of life. Now, of course, for Smith, this is not necessarily a bad thing, because it is, as he puts it, this deception that rouses and keeps in continual motion the industry of mankind. So it's this idea that somebody else has a more comfortable and a better situation than us, that we think we would be happier were we in their situation, that drives us to work hard and to improve our situation. According to Smith, this is a deception because often what we're pursuing are simply trinkets and baubles or consumer goods, which don't actually add to the real happiness of the individual. Again, this is not necessarily a problem because it is this activity that generates wealth in society, that drives forward economic development. Now, if we look at Ferguson, we see a very similar argument, but actually an even more sophisticated take on the problem. Ferguson himself believes that the necessary of life, necessity, is a very vague and relative term. It means different things to different people. What is necessary is different depending upon the society that you live in. And again, Smith does recognize this elsewhere in his work. So what it is that we pursue might not just be what is convenient and ornamental, it may also be what is necessary to us to live a standard of life in our society that is recognized as valuable, that is acknowledged by other members of that society. But Ferguson begins to dig into this because he believes that this is not a new phenomenon. This is not something that has simply occurred within commercial society. It's not that human societies became commercial and then we were transformed into being like this, comparing ourselves to others and pursuing consumer goods. That's the argument you find in Rousseau. Ferguson doesn't believe that's true. And if we look at the middle quote there on the page from the Principles, we see why he thinks it's not true. He thinks it's not true because he believes that human beings have always pursued superfluities and ornaments at the same time as they have pursued necessities. Because of this vague and relative relationship between the two terms, according to Ferguson, the same people who subsist from meal to meal, who can barely support themselves, if they get a free moment, they pursue ornament or comfort at the same time. The point for Ferguson then is that this desire to pursue goods which we believe will make us comfortable by comparing our present holdings against those of other people is something which exists in all human societies, not just in commercial societies. Now, here's where we begin to unpick this idea that Smith is the proponent of commercial society and Ferguson the skeptic about commercial society. Because what Ferguson's identifying here is a feature of human life which is driven in all societies. To take away from this then, both Smith and Ferguson believe that in most societies, most people, most of the time, have a security of subsistence that allows them to direct bettering their condition towards conveniences and ornament. And here's where the problem begins to arise for Smith. Remember Smith, the proponent of commerce. If we look at the theory of moral sentiments and the discussion of rank and ambition in part 1, chapter 3, what we find is Adam Smith being very skeptical about how this desire to improve our situation by comparing ourselves with others affects our moral beliefs. In fact, he calls it the great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. Now, it's useful, as he acknowledges at the beginning of this quote, because it allows us to create order and rank in society. People compare themselves to other people and rank themselves. They create a social structure which allows stability in society. But at the same time, this desire to have what other people have in terms of conveniences and superfluities becomes something which drives forward human beings in a way which he believes is problematic. And what's problematic about it is that they cease to value people on account of their personal characteristics and their moral virtues, and instead view people purely through their wealth and power. So what we find here is that Smith offers a moral criticism of rank based on wealth and consumerism. Commercial societies can be potentially corrupting of our morals. Now, one way we can anticipate what Smith, or we can understand what Smith is saying here, is by understanding that he is a sophisticated analyst of society. And if we look at this passage from later on in the theory of moral sentiments, we see him recognizing that what he has said in the past about the corruption of the moral sentiments by this type of rank-based commercial order, we recognize that that itself has been a politically useful thing. So it might be a bad thing for our moral sentiments that we compare ourselves to other people, that we admire the rich and we have contempt for the poor, but at the same time, that has provided a basis for order in society by identifying the different classes and allowing us to structure society around them. So there is a political value to wealth based upon rank, even though there might be a moral corruption attached to it. Now, if we move to Ferguson, what we find is that the supposed skeptic about commercial society actually has a more measured view than Smith. Because what Ferguson argues here in the essay on the history of civil society is that it's not property or the acquisition of material goods that's a problem. He doesn't think that those things really corrupt mankind. What he believes is a problem is this issue that Smith has identified, where we come to rank and estimate each other purely on the basis of wealth. Where promotion in society and status in society is based on wealth and power, we create a situation where we change the incentives for human beings, laying aside other virtues such as pursuit of the public good. This is the problem for Ferguson. But again, Ferguson stresses this is not unique to commercial society. The problem for Ferguson is not wealth per se. It is this absence of calls to attention on other subjects. As he puts it, nations in a high state of commercial arts are exposed to corruption by advancing wealth unsupported by personal elevation and virtue as the great foundation of the distinction in society. And here we have the heart of this question here. So this is talking to us about what is the relationship between the pursuit of wealth, the subject matter of political economy, and the moral philosophy of the period. And it seems clear that Ferguson is advancing an argument that it is not wealth per se that is the problem, but a society where wealth replaces other sources of status and influence. Where wealth replaces public duty as a way of people advancing their ambition and seeking service to their community, there is a real difficulty that emerges. But crucially, this is not unique to a commercial society for Ferguson. Corruption and luxury can occur at any level of wealth. The problem is a corruption of character. It is an issue to do with what people choose to spend their life pursuing. So as he puts it, we may find him become effeminate, mercenary, and sensual, not because the pleasures and profits are becoming more alluring, but because he has fewer calls to attend to other objects. So when the impact of political economy, when the impact of the pursuit of wealth is considered in the framework of moral philosophy in the Scottish Enlightenment, the problem that arises is not the problem of wealth per se, it's the problem of a society where wealth replaces other sources of virtue. And here now we can return to where we started, because ultimately Smith and Ferguson both provide a response to the danger of the corruption of moral sentiments by a commercial society, which substitutes wealth alone as a measure of rank. And that answer is the education system that they were both involved in teaching. It's education in a moral philosophical system, a system where natural theology, ethics, jurisprudence, and then police and political economy are combined together. What we see in the classrooms in 18th century Scotland is a practical education in moral philosophy. What it was aimed at was forming the character of those who would go on to become influential in society. And the aim was not to dissuade them from pursuing wealth or studying political economy. It was to ensure that at the same time that they did those things, they understood that they took place within a wider philosophical and ethical context, one which they would have been taught about in the classrooms of Glasgow and Edinburgh. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Smith. Seema, how much time do you have to discuss a little bit the presentation? I think that the following presentation is going to be in 10 minutes. So I guess we should have at least 5-10 minutes to discuss a little bit. I'm not sure.
Yes, you can.
Okay.
There is no question on YouTube channel.
Okay, that's right.
You have 10 minutes for discussion.
Okay, so this part is going to be cancelled on YouTube, right?
Yes.
Okay, so it's just a private discussion.
No, we are on YouTube channel now.
Yeah, I know, but I was just wondering whether this is not part of the presentation, or it is an integral part of the presentation. I mean, this kind of little discussion.
Okay.
Anyway, I thought it was a really wonderful presentation because in a sense, it makes justice, at least to Ferguson. Well, on the one hand, of course, Adam Smith is much more studied than Ferguson. So after some studies by Hayek, who tried to rediscover this intellectual tradition, Ferguson was a little bit forgotten, so to say, compared at least to other Scottish philosophers and so forth. So I think it's interesting also because it, yes, you are right. I mean, your starting point is right, at least in the sense that many are used to believe that Ferguson is more conservative. He was a little bit scared about the advancement of the commercial society, and that perhaps in him there was a kind of nostalgia about, the lost society. But just three very, very quick questions. The first one, when you said that their purpose was to inculcate virtue.
Yes.
I was wondering, at least with regard to Adam Smith, whether you consider the theory of moral sentiment as a kind of precept addressed to their pupils and so forth, because if you think about the theory of moral sentiment, well, of course, you can find some sort of moral precept, but it is more descriptive rather than evaluative. So this is the first question. Yeah. The second, I was really curious about the expression good government, because I've been studying good government for quite a while, and people are used not to cite that passage in Adam Smith from the book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, where he repeats 3 times the expression good government. So it's curious that I found it curious that you cited this, because I think it's a really interesting passage in the book that is perhaps a kind of juncture between the previous books and the following ones. So I was just wondering, what do you mean, or what do you intend, or what you guess is Adam Smith's interpretation of good government. And last question, yes, it was related to Ferguson nostalgia. So you don't believe this, to reconnect to the first question, as far as I understood, you don't believe that in Ferguson there is a sort of nostalgia, right? Thank you so much anyway.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's three very perceptive questions. Thanks. I agree with you about the theory of moral sentiments as a book. That is a book which is largely presented in the style of a descriptive theory of lived moral experience. The whole point of the book for Smith is to show us that his description of how we make moral judgments is better than that given by other thinkers. Now, given that that's also true, you can imagine how in the classroom that would become a way of teaching people how to make better moral decisions. Once you understand how you experience morality, once you understand that it's not reason alone, or it's not utility alone, or virtue alone, but a combination of these, then you become more self-conscious when you make moral decisions. So it's if you show people how it works, they'll be able to work it themselves. That's the inculcation part. On good government, I agree. I think this is a very interesting topic in Smith, which it's only over the last couple of years that people have begun to spend more time on what his view on government and on politics actually are. And I think there's some points that we can indicate as being central to that. I think good government, in his view, is one. A good government is one which is regular, is not arbitrary. I think good government is one which considers the interests of the whole of the society and not some particular part of the society. I think a good government is one which is willing to learn from the evidence of history and from political economy and to adapt as a response to that. And I think ultimately a good government is one which recognizes not just those sources of information, but at the same time recognizes its limitations, what it can and what it cannot do. So I think good government is kind of pragmatic, is a word lots of people use to describe Smith's politics, and I think that's a good way of grasping what his view of government is. He doesn't idolize it, but at the same time he doesn't dismiss it completely. So that's something which is important, putting it in its correct place.
Thank you. This is really interesting.
And finally, the Ferguson point. I don't think Ferguson was a nostalgist. I can understand why people have read him that way, because of some of the problems that he raises about the society around about him. But my view of him is that he raises those problems precisely to provide solutions to those problems. This is not a criticism of commercial society saying that it will inevitably produce selfish and vain individuals who will refuse to fight for their country or not pursue the public spirit. He's raising that as a problem to then explain how we address that problem. And you address that problem by educating individuals so that they don't make the mistake of purely pursuing wealth, and that you teach them in the moral philosophy classroom or whatever other classroom you're in, that there are other values that they ought to devote their lives to. So what we see is Ferguson raising a problem, a quite perceptive, critical problem, but then making the case of how we can address that issue. Now, that to me is not a nostalgist, because that's somebody who recognizes that his society is different from the societies that have gone before, but that those differences are not differences of kind or of degree. They're differences that can be responded to if we are aware of them and aware of how we might reliably reply to them.
Thank you so much. We are in perfect time.